Okay, we're going to finish up here with our organelles with the last set, and this is a really important group of organelles. The first couple we're going to talk about deal with a really important part of life, and that is energy. I keep bringing up the idea that a cell and life in general, we're machines, right? But we're biological machines. And we're machines that have moving parts. And these moving parts, for the most, mostly are proteins. And I hope you understand that at this point. Structurally, we're mostly made of proteins. Pretty much every chemical that your body uses, like hormones, antibodies, neurotransmitters, which you probably haven't heard of before, but that's what your brain uses to function. They're all proteins. So your cells are constantly making them. Sometimes the cells use the proteins inside, sometimes they send them out. And we've talked about all those parts that are involved in that. So now, what does a machine need to function? It needs energy, right? If you have a car and you want to drive, you need gasoline in there. You got to have something for the engine to use. If you have your computer and it's running out of battery, you got to plug it in to charge it. So cells also need energy. And they use a really important organelle called the mitochondria. Now, you probably have heard of that before in other classes. You might remember hearing it being called the powerhouse of the cell. And that's a good way to think of it, but I like to think of it as the generator, right? So when you think of electricity, you need a generator. And the generator converts one form of energy to electricity. So like there's a generator, you've probably seen wind power, where there's like a wind, fan going, and then that is used to produce energy. Or you might have seen a dam before, and the water falling over produces energy. Well, mitochondria do the same thing, but they're not using wind and they're not using water. Well, they actually do kind of use water a little bit, but what they're using is the movement of electrons, and we're going to talk all about that later on. But the point I want to make now is the mitochondria uses sugar, okay, so it uses glucose and oxygen to make energy. And the energy that our body uses and life uses is called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. We're going to talk more about that actually in the next unit. So basically, organelles, they use energy, chemical energy in food, and they use that energy in food and they convert it to a more useful form. And that happens in this thing called the mitochondria. And a mitochondria, it looks kind of like a little bean to me. It's got like a little bean shape, and cells have a lot of them. Some cells have more, cells that need more energy. For example, your muscle cells will have more mitochondria than other cells in the body because your muscles use a lot of energy, right? So that makes sense. And if you think of a mitochondria, it actually looks like this. Now, it's not the best diagram in the world, but it gives you the idea of what this thing looks like. It's an oval-shaped organelle, and it actually has two membranes. There's the outer membrane here, which is there to really protect everything. So think of that outer membrane as like the armor or the protection of what's inside. And then inside there's a second membrane, an inner membrane, which is called the cristae. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. But inside that second membrane, that is where all the magic happens. That is where sugar, glucose, and oxygen are used to produce energy. And that is what makes the whole cell run. So just to go back, so the outer membrane protects it, and the inner membrane is where energy is produced. This is found in plant cells and in animal cells, but not in bacteria. So you're going to see these in plant and animal cells. The next organelle we're going to talk about is a chloroplast. And a chloroplast, I keep moving myself, and the chloroplast is something that's unique to plants. So this is only going to be in plants. And this is really good example of evolution, right? This is a really good example of traits that are beneficial. Plants can't move, and plants need water. So basically what photosynthesis is a process in which plants take in water and carbon dioxide, and they use that to create sugar. So they make glucose. Plants can't get up and move, so they can't go hunt for their food. So they had to come up with some other option. So plants evolved this thing called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, the plants use the sun's energy, they absorb that energy in the leaves, and then they use that energy to convert water and carbon dioxide into sugar. And it's pretty amazing that that happens. So imagine if you could sit outside under the sun, put your hands out, and then all of a sudden you got a cheesesteak in your hands. That would be amazing, right? Well, plants don't make cheesesteaks, but they do make sugar. And then we come along and rip them out and eat them. But plants have this. Animals don't have it because we can move. So we have the ability to go find food. So if we didn't have that ability, one day we might evolve chloroplasts. So chloroplasts they don't make energy, they make the food that is required to use as energy. So chloroplasts also have plants also have mitochondria. They just don't have to go get the glucose to run the process. They make it, which is pretty amazing. Okay, the next organelles are going to be the cell barriers, right? You would feel really uncomfortable probably if somebody came and ripped down the walls of your house and you were just exposed to the world. That would be really, you would probably not relax very easily. Well, cells have walls as well, and they have two types of cell barriers. One is found in all cells, and the other one is specific to plants and some bacteria. So the first cell barrier is called the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is you probably imagine it being like this thick, tough layer. It's not. It's almost like if you've ever blown bubbles before, the soapy like bubbles where you blow it and they float around. That's kind of like what a cell membrane is like. It's got the fat like in soap, and it's a very thin layer, but it's got a semi-permeable lipid bilayer. What the heck does that mean? Well, permeable means that things can get through, right? You probably heard that term before. If something is permeable, things can get through. Semi means kind of sort of. So semi-permeable means some stuff gets through. So think of your window screen, right? When you open your window, you have a window screen. Air can get through, but bugs can't. So that's a semi-permeable screen. And it's a lipid bilayer. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's made of fat. That's a lipid. So those cells have that fatty outer layer. And if you remember, I mentioned cholesterol is in a cell membrane. That is also a fat. And it's a bilayer. And we're going to talk more about that later. But what that means is it's actually double layered. So it's a double layered membrane. And it's going to be in plants, animals, and bacteria. And the job of the cell the job of the cell membrane is really to control what gets in and out of a cell. And that's a really important job. We're going to talk more about that in the next section. The cell wall, on the other hand, is found only in plants, also in some fungi, and also in bacteria. And what that does is it provides support and protection. And this is going to be made out of that carbohydrate we talked about before called cellulose. And we actually can't digest cellulose. But some plants have a lot more cellulose than others. That's why we can't just rip a leaf off and eat it. Why do plants have cell walls? Well, if you take a look here, I drew a little picture. I drew a picture of a plant, and I drew a tree and some shrubs. Now, here's the thing that plants can't do. As I said before, they can't get up and move. They need the sun's energy. So the only way for them to get to the sun is to grow tall. So they needed some way. Like we have a skeleton, right? So you can stand upright because we have a backbone made of bone. Trees and plants don't have bones. They don't have that structure. So think of, and I drew some bricks here, think of a tree as a bunch of bricks where they built on each other and it stacks up. So when you think of a cell, a plant cell is really special. A plant cell has the cell membrane, right? And then around that cell membrane is this cell wall. And the cell wall is going to be kind of boxy. And it's made of cellulose, and it's tough. And what that does, if you tried to build a tree out of just the cell membranes, it would be squished. It wouldn't be able to build upwards. But now, by having the cell wall, you can stack another cell on top, just like bricks. And you can grow up nice and tall to get to the sun. So that's why cell walls exist in plants. It's there to give them that structural support that they need. And this is just a picture of the cell membrane. There's a double layer here, so that's the top layer, that's the bottom layer. And then down here, it just shows cells that have a cell wall. So you can see they have kind of a brick-like appearance. And finally, the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is basically the framework inside the cell. It's what supports and gives shape to the cell, and it's made of protein filaments or fibers. So if you've ever had a tent, you've probably seen a tent before, right? If you've ever gone camping, a tent is just a big piece of like material, and the way you get the tent to stand up is you put the long, thin poles in there, right? You put the poles in the tent, and now the tent stands up. So think of the cytoskeleton as being the proteins on the inside that give the cell its shape. The cell itself is just a blobby thing. So these microtubules, they really give, if you look at this image here, you can see all those little green lines are the microtubules. And they're what pretty much is holding this cell up and giving it its support. It also allows for objects to move through the cell. You might remember me showing you a video in the beginning of this section of this cool little protein called the kinase walking. It was walking along this long, thin like tube, that is the cytoskeleton. So things get around the cell. Like I talked about proteins getting made and moving around. That all happens because of the cytoskeleton. It's made of something called microfilaments and microtubules. They're both just thin proteins. A microfilament is going to be just basically a thin protein, like a thread, where a tubule is going to have a tube shape. But they are there to give support to the cell. And that is what we need to know about the organelles. Thank you very much.